Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a book that's been sparking debate for decades. Limits to Growth. We've got excerpts from their 30-year update. And let me tell you, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. We're going to be talking about humanity's impact on the planet. And you know the big question. Are we on a path towards sustainability or something a lot more worrisome?
You know what's really interesting about this book is that when it first came out back in 1972, a lot of people just weren't ready to accept the idea that there could be limits to what our planet can actually handle.
It's like we all just kind of assumed the Earth's resources were infinite.
Yeah.
Like we could just keep growing and consuming forever.
Exactly. But the authors of Limits to Growth, they were already sounding the alarm bells back then. They used this computer model called World 3 to simulate all these complex interactions between things like population resource use and pollution.
So World 3 is like a virtual planet Earth. So they could run simulations and see what might happen under different conditions.
Exactly. And one of the most mind-blowing insights that came out of World 3 is that even with like crazy technological advancements, if we don't deal with the core issue, which is exponential growth, we're still heading for a downturn.
Whoa, hold on. Even with all the mind-blowing tech we've got today and all the innovation that's still to come, we could still end up worse off.
But that's the stark warning coming from the model. Look, technology can definitely help us become more efficient, but it can't change the fundamental truth that our planet's resources are limited.
Okay, that is pretty sobering. I'm starting to see why this book has had such an impact. It's not about like predicting the future. It's more about understanding these underlying systems that are driving our world.
Yeah.
But if I'm being honest, when you talk about exponential growth, my brain kind of zones out. Can we make that a bit more concrete? Like, what does that actually look like in our daily lives?
Okay, think about it this way. Imagine you're folding a piece of paper in half, then in half again and again. At first, the change is tiny, but with every fold, the thickness doubles. And after a while, it becomes impossible to fold it anymore.
Okay, I see the analogy, but how does that connect to my life?
Think about the amount of data you use on your phone, or the amount of information online. It feels like just a few years ago, we were all hyped about dial-up, and now we're streaming movies on demand without even thinking about it. That's exponential growth in action.
Oh, okay, yeah, now that you mention it's everywhere. But how does this doubling effect tie into the whole limits to growth idea?
Well, it's pretty straightforward. This kind of growth can't go on forever. The authors of Limits to Growth, they point out, that we've been exceeding what the Earth can handle since the 1980s, our demand for resources combined with the pollution we create. It's just too much for the planet to regenerate and absorb.
It's like that saying, you can't keep drawing from the well without refilling it. But what are some actual signs that we're pushing past those limits? I mean, yeah, we've got climate change, but what else?
The book gives some pretty stark examples. You remember that aquifer in the U.S.? The Ogallala, the one farmers rely on. It's being drained way faster than it can be replenished.
Yeah, I've read about that. It's like a giant underground lake that's been shrinking for decades.
Hmm.
Actually, I visited a farm a while back that depends on that water. And you could see the worry in the farmer's eyes as he was talking about the water levels dropping.
It's a massive issue, especially as the need for food keeps rising. And then there's deforestation, especially in the tropics. We're losing huge areas of forest every year, and that has a knock-on effect on everything, from biodiversity to climate change.
So even things we consider renewable, like forests and water, they have their limits if we keep pushing them too hard.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of non-renewable resources, like fossil fuels. The book really drives home the point that we can't just keep digging them up forever. They're finite.
Okay, I'm getting the picture on the resource side of things. But where does all the stuff we use and the waste we produce, where does it all go? Is that where this sink concept comes in?
You got it. It's like the other side of resource extraction. Think of sinks as the Earth's natural systems
Yeah.
that soak up our waste products.
So like the oceans, the atmosphere, the soil, they're all acting like giant sponges, cleaning up the mess from our industrial world.
Precisely. But just like resources, sinks have a limit, a limited capacity. And some types of waste are worse than others. Stuff like nuclear waste, hazardous chemicals, and greenhouse gases, those things stick around in the environment, sometimes for hundreds of years.
It's like we're throwing this never-ending party, but we totally forgot about taking out the trash.
Yeah.
And it's starting to pile up and stink.
That's a perfect analogy. It brings us back to climate change. We're basically overloading the atmosphere's ability to deal with all this CO2, which leads to all sorts of problems like rising sea levels and extreme weather. Reading about ocean acidification really got to me.
Ocean acidification. I haven't heard much about that.
It's a direct consequence of all that extra CO2 in the atmosphere. The ocean's like this massive carbon sink, soaking up a huge amount of it. But as it does that, the water gets more acidic. And that's devastating for marine life, especially things like shellfish and coral reefs.
So it's not just about the temperature going up. It's messing with the chemistry of the ocean itself. What does all this mean for someone like me? Someone who enjoys seafood now and then, and dreams of snorkeling on a coral reef someday.
Well, on a basic level, it could mean fewer fish to eat and bleach dead coral reefs. But on a larger scale, it disrupts whole ecosystems and food chains, which eventually affects us all.
Okay, I'm starting to see how everything's connected. It's like pulling on a thread in a sweater.
Yeah.
And watching the whole thing unravel. So if we're exceeding these limits, what are our options? Does the book give any solutions? Or is it all doom and gloom?
That's where things get interesting. The book doesn't just lay out the problem, it also explores potential solutions through different scenarios.
So they're kind of saying, okay, what if we change this variable or adjust that policy? How would the system react?
Exactly. They looked at what happens if we just keep doing what we're doing, the business as usual approach. And let me tell you, the model paints a pretty bleak picture. Think resource depletion, food shortages, economic instability, the whole shebang. It's not pretty.
Okay, so that's the stay the course scenario. And it sounds like a recipe for disaster. What about the scenarios where they factored in technological solutions? Does tech give us a way out?
They definitely explored those scenarios, and technology definitely has a role to play. But it's not a silver bullet.
But I thought we were living in this age of incredible technological breakthroughs. We can invent our way out of this mess.
Right. It's not that simple. Even in scenarios with major technological advancements, the model still shows things eventually going downhill.
I'm having trouble wrapping my head around this. If we're getting more efficient, using fewer resources to make more stuff, shouldn't that at least buy us some time?
It does help, but the issue is even with increased efficiency, we're still ultimately dependent on finite resources. As those resources get scarcer, the cost of getting them goes up, eating into our capital, and eventually leading to economic decline.
So it's like a treadmill. We keep running faster just to stay in the same place. Feels like we need a more fundamental shift, something beyond just technological fixes.
That's where the concept of sustainability comes in. The book defines it as meeting the needs of today's generation without messing things up for future generations.
Okay, that makes sense from a philosophical standpoint. But how do we turn that into actual action? What does a sustainable society look like in practice?
It's not about stopping progress. It's about shifting our focus from just acquiring more and more stuff to prioritizing genuine well-being. It's about ensuring everyone has access to resources so that everyone can live a good life.
That sounds beautiful, but also really idealistic. How do we bridge the gap between this vision and the reality of our world, a world driven by consumerism and short-term thinking?
The book offers some guidelines, and it all starts with long-term thinking. We have to look beyond the next quarter's profits or the next election cycle and consider the long-term consequences of our choices.
It's like we're all obsessed with the next mile marker instead of the final destination.
Yeah.
What else do they suggest?
They talk about the need to redefine how we measure progress. Instead of relying on just economic indicators like GDP, we should focus on things like health, happiness, and community.
So it's about asking ourselves, are we building a world where people can actually thrive? Not just survive, but truly flourish.
Exactly. They also highlight the importance of being more aware of warning signs. Instead of waiting for a crisis to happen, we need to be much more proactive in anticipating problems and addressing them before they get out of hand.
It's like we've been relying on the emergency room, when what we really need is preventative care. So it's about being smarter about how we use resources, being more aware of our impact, and shifting our focus from quantity to quality.
Precisely. And they emphasize the need to move away from this constant pressure for exponential growth. Instead of always wanting more, 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 maybe it's time to ask ourselves, how much is enough?
That's a profound question, one that I don't think our current economic system can even answer. It feels like such a radical shift from the way we've been doing things. Do they offer any real-world examples of societies that have actually achieved this kind of sustainability?
They don't get into specific case studies, but they do highlight common threads that run through the successful scenarios in their model.
I'm all ears. Tell me about those success stories. What sets them apart?
Well, for one thing, they all involve a conscious decision to reduce humanity's impact on the planet. It's not something that just happens naturally. It takes effort and intention.
So it's about acknowledging that we're overshooting the planet's limits and making a deliberate choice to scale back our consumption.
Exactly. And that often involves tough decisions about resource allocation, population growth, and economic priorities. It's about recognizing that unlimited growth on a finite planet just isn't possible.
Yeah. It's kind of like a paradox. We have to consume less to ultimately live better.
Right.
But I guess that gets to the core of what sustainability is really about. It's not about deprivation. It's about changing what we prioritize and recognizing that true well-being isn't about how much stuff we accumulate.
Absolutely. And you know the successful scenarios in Limits to Growth, they all highlight this idea of long-term thinking. It's about prioritizing the well-being of future generations, not just our immediate gratification.
Yeah, it's about playing the long game,
Yeah.
recognizing we're part of something much bigger than ourselves, a story that goes way beyond our own lifetimes. And that brings me to a question that's been bugging me. Do they give us any kind of timeline for all of this? I mean, is there like a point of no return, a deadline we need to hit before it's too late?
They do touch on that. And it's not so much about setting a specific deadline, it's more about understanding that. The longer we wait to take action, the harder and more expensive it gets.
The classic procrastination problem. Putting it off only makes it worse.
Exactly. The book emphasizes that we do have a window of opportunity to act. But that window is closing. Each year we wait, the risks go up, and the chances of a smooth transition to sustainability go down.
Okay, so there's a sense of urgency here. But it's not about freaking out or giving up. It's about understanding the challenge and using that energy to do something positive.
I like how you put that. We need to shift from a mindset of fear and lack to one of abundance and opportunity. And I think that's where the book really offers hope.
Tell me more about that. What gives you hope in all of this?
Well, the book clearly shows that a sustainable future isn't about sacrifice. It's actually about building a world that's more fair, more just, and ultimately more fulfilling.
So it's not about lowering our standard of living. It's about redefining what a good life really means.
Exactly. It's about shifting our priorities away from material possessions and towards things like strong communities, meaningful relationships, connecting with nature, and finding a sense of purpose.
It's funny, we started this deep dive talking about limits, but now it feels like we're talking about limitless possibilities. It's like by embracing those limits, we actually open ourselves up to a whole new world of potential.
I love that perspective, and I think that's the message I really hope people get from Limits to Growth. It's not meant to be a depressing book. It's about empowerment. It's about recognizing that we have the power to shape the future, and the choices we make today will determine the kind of world we leave behind.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that we're not just passengers on this spaceship Earth. We're the crew. We have a responsibility to steer this thing towards a sustainable future. But that leads to another question. How do we actually do that? What are the practical steps we can take to get there?
Well, the book gives us a framework for thinking about these challenges and making smarter decisions. It encourages us to extend our planning horizons, redefine how we measure progress, and be more responsive to those warning signs.
Those are all great guiding principles,
Yeah.
but they feel a bit abstract. Do they offer any concrete examples of things we can actually do?
They stress the importance of moving away from this constant push for exponential growth in both population and material consumption. It's about figuring out ways to separate economic growth from environmental damage.
So instead of always chasing more, we should be asking ourselves, what can we achieve with less? How can we live more simply, more sustainably, but still have fulfilling lives?
Precisely. It's about rethinking our whole relationship with consumption, recognizing that true wealth isn't about how much we own, it's about the quality of our lives and the well-being of our communities.
It's a powerful idea, and I think it speaks to a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
who feel overwhelmed by the pace of modern life and the constant pressure to buy more stuff.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's about taking back control. The book reminds us that we're not helpless in the face of these problems. We can make different choices, demand better from our leaders, and create a future that's both sustainable and something we actually want.
It's a call to action, an invitation to be part of something bigger than ourselves, and to contribute our own unique talents and passions to making the world better.
And I think that's a great note to leave our listeners on. This deep dive is just the start. I encourage everyone to check out Limits to Growth for themselves. It's a book that can really shift your perspective.
Totally agree. It's definitely a challenging read, but also incredibly inspiring. It reminds us that we have a choice. Keep doing what we're doing and risk a future of scarcity and decline. Or choose a different path, one that leads to a more sustainable and thriving future.
And that choice ultimately rests with each of us.
Well, that's a pretty empowering thought to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. I hope it's given you some new ideas and inspired you to get involved.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.